The humiliation. The school courtyard was always a noisy place. During breaks, students gathered in groups, talking loudly, laughing, and sometimes making fun of each other in ways that were not always kind. In the middle of that crowd stood David, a quiet boy who kept to himself most of the time. He wore the same navy blue hoodie almost every day, and carried a backpack that had started to lose its shape because of how much he stuffed inside it. David was not like many of the other kids at school. He did not join in their games, he did not talk much in class, and he never showed off. While others spent their afternoons playing basketball or hanging out at the mall, David often disappeared, going straight home. Nobody really knew much about him, and because of that, the bullies saw him as an easy target. On that particular afternoon, the crowd in the courtyard was louder than usual. The bullies had found their victim again. Two boys, both taller than David, stood in front of him, blocking his way. Their voices were sharp and their laughter carried over the courtyard. Students nearby turned their heads, curious to see what was happening. One of the bullies leaned in close, his face just inches away from David's. "Why do you even bother coming here?" he sneered. "You don't belong here," the other bully added with a cruel smirk. "Yeah, why don't you go back to where you came from? Back to Africa." The words stung the air like poison. Some students gasped. Others chuckled nervously, not sure if they should laugh or stay silent. David stood still, his backpack hanging loosely from one shoulder, his hands clenched at his sides. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The bullies grinned wider, feeding on his silence. They had expected anger, maybe even tears, but David refused to give them what they wanted. His silence made them push harder. "What? Got nothing to say?" The first bully mocked. "Cat got your tongue? Or maybe you don't even know how to speak English properly." The second bully laughed loudly, slapping his friend on the shoulder. "Maybe he needs us to teach him how things work here. Maybe we should remind him this isn't his place." The circle of students watching grew larger. Some crossed their arms, some whispered to each other, and some looked away uncomfortably, but no one stepped in. For them, it was just another day of watching the bullies find their entertainment. David's chest rose and fell slowly. He wanted to say something, to shout back, but he remembered his mother's words from long ago. "Do not let their words turn you into them. Your silence will speak louder than their cruelty." So he stood there, quiet, his eyes steady. The silence only angered the bullies more. One of them shoved David lightly on the shoulder, trying to provoke him into reacting. "Come on, fight back. Or are you too weak?" David stumbled slightly but regained his balance. He still said nothing. His heart pounded inside his chest like a drum, and every muscle in his body begged him to defend himself, but he held back. He had learned long ago that some battles are not worth fighting, not in the way bullies expect. The crowd laughed again, this time more uncomfortably. Some students looked at David with pity, while others seemed almost impressed by how he refused to respond. But the bullies did not care. They wanted to humiliate him, to make him feel smaller than he already looked. "Go back to Africa," the first bully shouted again, louder this time, making sure everyone could hear. His words hung in the air like a cruel banner. This time David lifted his head. His eyes locked onto the bully's face. There was no anger in his expression, no tears, no sign of weakness. Instead, there was something else, something the bully did not understand. A quiet strength. A calm that almost felt intimidating. For a split second, the bully hesitated. He had expected fear, maybe even rage, but not this. David's eyes did not look away. They stayed locked on his, steady and unshaken. The crowd went quiet too, sensing something different. But before anything else could happen, the school bell rang, cutting through the tension. Students began to scatter, the crowd breaking apart. Some of them whispered about what had just happened. Others shrugged and walked away. The bullies gave David one last shove before leaving, smirking as if they had won. David adjusted his backpack, pulled his hoodie tighter, and walked away slowly. He did not look back, but inside the words echoed in his mind. Go back to Africa. They hurt, but not in the way the bullies imagined. For David, those words became fuel. He thought of his mother, who worked double shifts just to keep their small apartment. He thought of his younger sister, who looked up to him as her protector. He thought of the long nights he spent studying, determined to create a future that would lift his family out of hardship. As he walked down the hallway toward his next class, he whispered to himself almost like a promise, one day, they will know the truth. That day in the courtyard became a memory that burned in his heart. But David knew something the bullies did not. He knew that strength was not measured by how loud you shouted or how hard you hit. Strength was measured by how much pain you could endure without losing yourself. And David had already endured more than anyone at that school could imagine. After that day in the courtyard, David carried the memory of the humiliation with him like a heavy stone. The bullies believed they had broken him, that their words would echo inside his mind and crush his spirit. But they did not know the world David lived in outside those school walls. They did not know that his life had already taught him resilience, long before they ever decided to target him. When the final bell rang that afternoon, David walked home alone, his footsteps slow but his heart steady. The street was quiet, lined with old houses that had seen better days. Paint peeled off the fences, weeds grew through the cracks in the pavement, and the sound of distant sirens reminded everyone that this was not the safest neighborhood. But to David, it was home. As he turned the corner, he saw his younger sister, Naomi, waiting for him on the porch. She was only 8 years old, her backpack bigger than her frame, and her smile was bright enough to melt away the weight of the day. She ran to him, wrapping her arms around his waist. "You're late," she said, looking up at him with wide eyes. David forced a small smile. "Had to stay back a little," he replied. He did not tell her about the courtyard, about the laughter, about the words that burned inside him. Naomi did not need to know about the ugliness of the world just yet. Inside their small apartment, the air smelled faintly of cleaning supplies. Their mother had already left for her evening shift at the diner. On the kitchen counter, a note was taped to a jar. In her neat handwriting, she had written, "Dinner is in the fridge. Study hard. I'm proud of you." David read it silently, his throat tightening. He knew how hard his mother worked. 2 jobs, sometimes 3, just to keep food on the table and rent paid on time. She never complained, never let her children see her breakdown, even though David sometimes heard her crying softly in her room at night. He heated up the leftovers, serving Naomi before taking his own plate. They ate together quietly, the television playing softly in the background. Naomi talked about her day at school, about how she got a gold star for her spelling test, about how her teacher said she was one of the smartest in class. David listened, nodding, encouraging her. For those moments, he let go of his own pain and focused only on her joy. After dinner, while Naomi did her homework, David sat at the small wooden desk in the corner of their living room. His textbooks were stacked high, papers scattered across the surface. He opened his math book, his pencil tapping nervously on the page. His mind wanted to drift back to the bullies, to the sting of their words, but he forced himself to focus. He remembered his mother's voice again. "Do not let them define you. You are more than their words," so he worked. He solved equations, he read chapters, he memorized definitions. He knew that every answer he wrote was a step toward something greater. He believed that education was his way out, his path to a future where the voices of bullies could no longer reach him. Hours passed. The night grew colder. Naomi had fallen asleep on the couch, her pencil still in her hand. David gently picked her up, carried her to her room, and tucked her under her blanket. He stood by the door for a moment, watching her sleep peacefully, and whispered to himself, "I'll make sure she is better than this. Better than what they think we deserve." Then he returned to his desk. His eyes burned with exhaustion, but he refused to stop. What the bullies could never understand was that David's silence was not weakness. It was strength. It was the kind of strength that comes from carrying burdens no one else could see. While they laughed and mocked, David was learning to endure. While they wasted their energy on cruelty, David was building his future in the quiet hours of the night. At school the next day, David walked through the halls with his usual calm expression. The bullies noticed him, whispered among themselves, and waited for a reaction. But he gave them none. His silence unsettled them more than anger ever could. They expected him to break. Instead, he bent but never snapped. There were moments when teachers noticed the tension but said nothing, moments when students glanced his way with pity but kept walking. It hurt, yes, but David reminded himself that the opinions of those who laughed at him did not matter. What mattered was his family, his future, and the promise he carried inside his heart. At lunchtime, David often sat alone under a tree at the far end of the courtyard. He would eat quietly, sometimes sketching in his notebook, sometimes writing down melodies that played in his head. Music had always been his hidden refuge. His father, before he passed away, had given him an old violin, scratched and worn but still playable. It was the one possession David treasured most. Late at night, when the city was quiet and Naomi was asleep, he would take out the violin and play. The soft notes filled the small apartment, wrapping around him like a shield. In those moments, he was no longer the boy mocked in the courtyard. He was someone else, someone powerful, someone untouchable. Music reminded him that the world was bigger than the cruelty of a few voices. It gave him the strength to endure their insults without letting them poison his soul. And so, day after day, David endured. He kept his head down, but his mind remained sharp. He stayed silent, but inside him grew a fire that no insult could extinguish. The bullies thought they had humiliated him, but they were blind to the truth. They did not see the long nights, the sacrifices, the quiet determination that made David stronger than all of them combined. They thought his silence meant defeat. But one day soon, they would realize it meant something else entirely. They would realize that David's silence was not emptiness, it was preparation. The days turned into weeks, and the memory of that courtyard humiliation never fully left David's mind. The bullies carried themselves with the same arrogance, walking through the hallways like they owned the school. Whenever they passed David, they smirked, sometimes muttering under their breath, sometimes laughing loudly as though his silence gave them permission to keep going. But while they spent their time trying to look powerful in front of others, David spent his time building something inside himself. Every evening after homework was done, after his sister had fallen asleep, after his mother had returned late from her shift and kissed his forehead goodnight, he would quietly open the old violin case resting in the corner of his room. The violin was not pretty. Its varnish had faded, the wood was scratched, and one of the tuning pegs was chipped. Yet to David it was priceless. It was the last gift from his father before he passed away. His father had always told him, "Music will take you places words cannot." David held on to those words with all his heart. He would lift the violin, press it gently under his chin, and let the bow draw across the strings. At first the notes were shaky, imperfect, but as the hours passed, his music grew fuller, steadier, more alive. The apartment would fill with melodies, sometimes soft and gentle, sometimes sharp and powerful. Each note carried his struggles, his pain, but also his hope. When he played, he felt free. He was no longer the boy mocked in the courtyard. He was not the quiet kid with hand-me-down clothes or the target of cruel jokes. In those moments, he was something greater. One evening, Naomi peeked out of her room, rubbing her sleepy eyes, and whispered, "David, your music makes me dream better." Those words stayed with him, reminding him that his talent was not just his own, it was a gift he could share. What David did not know was that his music would soon break through the silence of his life in a way nobody expected. At school, a notice appeared on the bulletin board: Community Talent Showcase open to all students. It was an annual event where kids could show their skills: singing, dancing, comedy, magic tricks, whatever they wanted. For most students, it was just a fun evening to impress their friends and families. But for David, it stirred something deeper. He stood in front of the notice and staring at it, his heart racing. Could he really do it? Could he step on a stage where everyone, including the bullies, would be watching? Doubt gnawed at him. He remembered their laughter, their cruel words, the way the crowd had watched in silence while he was mocked. What if they laughed again? What if they booed? What if his hands trembled so much he could not even play a single note? But then he remembered Naomi's sleepy smile, his mother's tired but proud eyes, and his father's voice telling him that music could take him places words could not. He clenched his fists, took a deep breath, and signed his name on the registration sheet. The days leading up to the showcase were filled with practice. After finishing his schoolwork, David played for hours. His fingers grew sore, his shoulders ached, but he refused to stop. He practiced not just the notes, but the emotion behind them. He wanted every sound to tell his story, the loneliness, the pain, but also the strength he had found in silence. On the night of the showcase, the school auditorium buzzed with excitement. Families filled the seats, students whispered to each other, and teachers greeted parents at the door. Bright lights illuminated the stage, and the sound of chatter echoed through the room. Backstage, David stood with his violin case clutched tightly in his hands. His palms were sweaty, and his heart pounded so loudly he thought others could hear it. He watched as performers went up one by one, Singers belting out pop songs, dancers spinning under the lights, kids cracking jokes that made the audience laugh. Then came the moment. A teacher called his name. "Next we have David Johnson." The auditorium quieted. David stepped onto the stage, his old violin in hand. For a moment he froze. The bright lights blinded him, and he could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes staring at him. In the crowd he spotted the bullies sitting together, smirking, whispering. His stomach twisted with fear, but then he remembered Naomi's voice. "Your music makes me dream better." He took a deep breath, lifted the violin to his chin, and began to play. The first note was soft, almost fragile, like a whisper in the dark. Then another note followed, stronger, and then another. Slowly, the melody grew, filling the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. The audience leaned forward, caught off guard. This was not the sound of a beginner. This was the sound of someone pouring his entire soul into music. David's bow moved across the strings with grace and precision. His fingers danced along the neck of the violin, weaving together a story without words. The music rose and fell like waves, sometimes calm, sometimes fierce, always alive. The bullies who had expected him to fail sat in stunned silence. Their smirks faded. They had never seen this side of him. The boy they thought was weak, the boy they mocked, now commanded the entire auditorium without saying a single word. Some parents in the audience closed their eyes, swaying gently to the music. Teachers exchanged glances of surprise, whispering to each other about his talent. Naomi sat in the front row, her eyes wide with pride, clapping her hands softly even before the piece had finished. As the final note rang out, a silence swept through the auditorium. For a heartbeat, the world seemed to stop. Then suddenly the silence broke into thunderous applause. People stood from their seats, cheering, clapping, whistling. The sound washed over David like a wave, and for the first time in a long time, he felt seen, not as the boy mocked in the courtyard, but as someone worthy of respect. David lowered his violin, his hands trembling, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He looked out at the sea of faces, and his eyes landed on the bullies again. They were no longer smirking. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide. They looked shaken, almost frightened, as if they had just realized something terrifying. Their words had no power over him anymore. That night, David did not just play music. He revealed the truth hidden in his silence. The bullies had thought they broke him, but in front of the entire school, David showed them the strength they could never take away, and that was only the beginning. The night of the showcase was one David would never forget. For hours after his performance, people kept approaching him, teachers shaking his hand, parents smiling warmly, students whispering to each other in amazement. His music had done something no words could ever achieve. It had touched hearts. When he walked out of the auditorium, violin case in hand, he felt lighter. The air was cool against his face, and the stars glittered above the school roof. For the first time in a long while, he walked with his shoulders back and his head held high. He had not just played for the crowd, he had played for himself, for his family. For every moment he had swallowed the pain of cruel words. The bullies lingered near the exit, their usual arrogance absent. They looked unsettled, as though something inside them had been shaken loose. One of them opened his mouth, perhaps to say something mocking, but no words came. David passed by them without a glance. That silence, heavy and unshaken, was louder than anything he could have spoken. Over the next few days, the atmosphere at school changed. People who once ignored him began to nod in the hallways, some even smiling at him. A few classmates asked him about his music, their voices filled with curiosity rather than scorn. For David, it was strange. He had spent so long being invisible or ridiculed that he did not know what to do with this sudden attention. But what truly surprised him was when his music teacher pulled him aside after class. "David," she said softly, "do you know how rare your talent is?" He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "I just practice a lot." She shook her head firmly. "No, it's more than practice. You have a gift, and gifts like this open doors. I've already spoken to some colleagues of mine, and there are programs, scholarships, even conservatories that would be lucky to have you. You could go far with this, David, far beyond this town, this school, this small stage." Her words struck him harder than any insult ever had. Scholarships? Conservatories? He had always dreamed of something greater, but those dreams had felt distant, fragile, too heavy to hold on to in the face of daily struggles. Now suddenly someone was telling him they were within reach. That night when he got home, he found his mother sitting at the kitchen table, exhaustion etched into her face as she sorted through bills. He hesitated before telling her about what his teacher had said. At first, she just stared at him, silent. Then her eyes filled with tears, not of sadness but of pride. She reached across the table, taking his hands in hers. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling, "your father always believed you would do something extraordinary. He used to say that the world would one day hear your music, and now it's happening." Hearing his father's name spoken with such hope made David's chest ache, but also filled him with determination. He promised himself then that he would not waste this chance. He would push harder, reach higher, and prove not only to the world but also to himself that he was capable of greatness. Word about David's performance spread beyond the school. A local community paper featured a small article about the showcase, mentioning the quiet student with the violin who stunned the audience. Neighbors who had once barely noticed him stopped his mother in the grocery store to ask about her son. Naomi proudly told anyone who would listen, "That's my brother. He plays the violin better than anyone." Even the bullies could not escape the ripple effect. Their friends teased them quietly now, not about David, but about how they had once wasted their time picking on someone who turned out to be extraordinary. Their laughter at him had become their embarrassment. One afternoon, David found himself sitting alone under his usual tree at lunch, violin case beside him. He was sketching out a new melody in his notebook when a shadow fell across the page. Looking up, he saw one of the bullies, the very one who had shouted at him to go back to Africa. The boy shifted awkwardly, scratching the back of his neck. His usual sneer was gone. "Hey," he muttered, not meeting David's eyes. You were good the other night." "Really good?" David studied him silently. For a moment, he thought about all the things he could say, all the anger, the hurt, the humiliation. But instead, he simply nodded and went back to his notebook. The bully hesitated, then walked away. For the first time, it was clear. The power had shifted. As weeks passed, David began receiving invitations to perform at small community events, church gatherings, local fundraisers, even a city festival. Each performance drew more people, more applause, more recognition. Teachers who once barely noticed him now spoke of him with pride. Students who once laughed now sat in the audience, clapping, some even cheering his name. But beyond all the attention, what mattered most to David was how his music made people feel. After one performance at a community center, an elderly woman came up to him with tears in her eyes. She held his hand and said, "When you played, I remembered my late husband. He used to play the violin too. You brought him back to me for a moment. Thank you." Moments like that reminded David why he kept playing. His music was not about proving the bullies wrong anymore. It was about giving something to the world, about using his gift to touch lives. At home, Naomi started picking up her brother's old practice pieces on a small keyboard she borrowed from school. Their mother watched them both with a mixture of pride and disbelief. The small apartment, once filled only with the noise of exhaustion and worry, now echoed with melodies, laughter, and dreams. Still, David never forgot the humiliation that had pushed him here. He carried it with him, not as a wound, but as a reminder. Those cruel words had once tried to break him, but instead they became the fire that fueled him. The bullies had tried to define him with their hatred, but the revelation was clear now. They had no control over his story. The terrifying truth they were slowly learning was that David was not weak. He was unstoppable, and his journey had only just begun. The air around David seemed to change as months passed. He was still the same boy who walked through the school hallways quietly, but there was a new presence about him now. People looked at him differently. They no longer saw a target. They saw someone who had done something extraordinary, someone who had shown courage and strength without ever raising his voice or his fists. But not everyone adjusted to this change easily. The bullies, once so confident, found themselves shrinking in the shadow of David's rising reputation. Their laughter had lost its sharpness. Their jokes no longer landed. The more people admired David, the more the bullies' own cruelty seemed small, childish, and pathetic. One of them, Mark, the loudest of the group, struggled with this the most. He had always fed on power, on making others feel weak so that he could feel strong. But now, when he looked at David, he felt something he had never felt before: shame. The turning point came on a gray Friday afternoon. Rain tapped against the classroom windows as students packed their bags, eager for the weekend. David was gathering his books when he felt a shadow fall over his desk. He looked up, and there stood Mark, shifting uneasily, his usual smirk nowhere to be seen. "Can I talk to you?" Mark asked, his voice quieter than David had ever heard it. The classroom was nearly empty. A few students lingered, whispering as they noticed the strange sight of the bully standing nervously in front of the boy he had mocked for so long. David raised his eyes slowly, meeting Mark's. He did not answer right away, but something in his calm gaze made Mark swallow hard. Mark hesitated, scratching at the back of his neck. "I wanted to say, you were really good." At the showcase, David said nothing. He simply slid the last of his books into his bag and zipped it up. Mark's face flushed. "I mean it. I've never seen anyone play like that. It was different, powerful." Still, David stayed silent. His quietness was not cold, it was steady, unshaken. Mark shifted again. "Look, I know I've said things, bad things, stuff I shouldn't have. I thought it made me look tough, but—" He trailed off, glancing at the floor. "Truth is, it just made me a coward." For the first time, David spoke, his voice calm and even. "Why are you telling me this?" Mark's eyes flickered with something between guilt and fear. "Because I can't stop thinking about it. The things I said, they weren't about you. They were about me. I was angry, jealous maybe. You never fought back, and it made me feel like I had control. But now, I see that you were stronger all along." The classroom was silent. Even the students lingering nearby leaned closer, their curiosity holding them in place. David stood slowly, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He looked Mark straight in the eyes, and in that moment Mark expected anger. He expected David to shout, to throw his words back at him, to humiliate him the way he had once done so easily. But instead, David said something else. "Something simple. Hate weakens you," he said softly. "I will not carry it with me." The words hung in the air like a heavy truth. Mark's throat tightened, and for once he had no comeback. He just nodded slowly, his eyes cast down, and walked out of the classroom. The students who had overheard exchanged glances, their whispers carrying across the room. They would remember that moment because it showed them something rare. Real strength was not in humiliation or revenge, but in rising above it. From that day on, something shifted not just between David and Mark, but in the entire school. People began to look at David not just as the boy who could play music beautifully, but as someone whose strength came from a place deeper than talent. He had endured cruelty and still chosen dignity over hate. The bullies, stripped of their false power, found themselves standing on uncertain ground. One by one, they stopped targeting others. The mocking laughter that had once filled the courtyard grew quieter, replaced by a new awareness. But the turning point was not just about how others saw David. It was also about how David saw himself. For years, he had carried the weight of humiliation, swallowing his pain and turning it into silence. But now he realized that his silence had never been weakness. It had been discipline. It had been strength. At home, Naomi noticed the change too. "You walk different now," she said one evening as David helped her with her homework. He looked at her curiously. "What do you mean?" "You used to walk like you didn't want people to see you," she explained, her eyes thoughtful. "Now you walk like you know they're watching, and you don't care." David smiled softly, ruffling her hair. Out of the mouths of children came truths adults often overlooked. His mother also saw the shift. One night, after her long shift at the diner, she sat with him at the kitchen table, her tired eyes filled with pride. "You've grown, David. Not just taller, stronger. Your father would be proud." Those words meant more to him than any applause. They reminded him of why he kept going, not for recognition, not even for revenge, but for the promise he had made to himself and his family. The turning point in David's life was not about defeating the bullies. It was about realizing that he had already won. Their words had tried to define him, but he had refused to let them. He had chosen to rise above, and in doing so, he had shown the entire school and even the bullies themselves what real strength looked like. The humiliation in the courtyard was no longer a wound. It was a lesson. And the boy who once stood in silence now carried himself with a quiet power that could not be shaken. The weeks after Mark's apology felt different. The air in the school hallways carried less cruelty and more curiosity. Students who had once stayed silent during the courtyard humiliations now nodded at David when they passed him. Some even stopped to ask about his music, about how long he had been practicing, about whether he would perform again. David answered politely, but he did not let the attention distract him. He knew how quickly admiration could fade, how quickly the same people cheering could become silent again. His focus stayed on his studies, his family, and his music. Yet something inside him shifted. He no longer carried the same heavy silence of a boy who feared ridicule. He carried the silence of a boy who had learned how to rise above it. The bullies, meanwhile, felt the walls closing in. Without an audience laughing at their cruelty, their voices lost power. Some of them drifted away quietly, embarrassed by the past. Others kept their distance, unsure of how to approach the boy they once mocked but who now seemed untouchable. Mark, though, lingered. He did not return to his old habits. Instead, he walked the halls with a different expression, quieter, more thoughtful. One afternoon in history class, the teacher asked for volunteers to lead a project presentation. The room went still, as it often did when teachers asked for work that involved speaking in front of everyone. David kept his head down, taking notes. But then, to his surprise, Mark raised his hand. "Can I do it with David?" Mark asked. The class shifted uneasily. Whispers rippled through the students. The teacher blinked in surprise but nodded. If David agrees, all eyes turned to him. David looked up slowly, meeting Mark's gaze. For a moment he saw a flicker of the old bully in his nervous eyes, but layered beneath it was something new. Sincerity. After a pause, David nodded once. The project became a test, not of academic skill, but of how much things had changed. At first, Mark struggled. He stumbled over words, lost his place in notes, and flushed with embarrassment when the class giggled. David, calm and steady, stepped in each time, guiding him without a trace of mockery. By the end of the week, their presentation flowed smoothly. When they finished, the teacher smiled and said, "Well done, both of you. That was excellent teamwork." It was a small moment, but in that classroom everyone noticed it. The boy once humiliated and the bully once feared had stood side by side, and neither had fallen. Later, when they were packing their bags, Mark muttered, "Thanks for not making me look stupid back there." David glanced at him, his voice even. "I don't need to." Mark understood. He lowered his head, realizing that the lesson was not just about music or silence or apologies. It was about dignity, the kind of dignity that could not be stolen by cruelty. The rest of the school year passed with David's reputation continuing to grow. He performed at a city event, where a music professor from a prestigious academy happened to be in the audience. Afterward, the professor approached him with a card and a smile. "You have something rare," he said. "When you play, people listen, not just with their ears, but with their hearts. You should consider auditioning for our program." David took the card, his fingers trembling. He thought of his father, of his mother's sacrifices, of Naomi's proud eyes. He realized that all the nights of silence, all the humiliations endured, all the battles fought within himself had led to this moment. At home, when he shared the news, his mother hugged him tightly, her tears soaking into his hoodie. "This is the beginning, David. The world is opening for you." Naomi jumped up and down, clapping. "I told you, you're the best." But beyond his family's joy, David felt something deeper. He understood now what the bullies had never known. Their words had not defined him. His response to them had. He had not chosen anger. He had not chosen revenge. He had chosen resilience, dignity, and silence when it mattered most. That choice had given him strength far greater than their cruelty could ever take away. The lesson was clear. Hate weakens. But love, discipline, and courage build strength that lasts a lifetime. Over time, even students who had once laughed began to change. They saw that cruelty had no glory, no lasting reward. They saw that strength was not about who could shout the loudest, but about who could rise the highest after being pushed down. David became more than just a boy with a violin. He became a symbol, quietly reminding everyone that pain could be turned into power and humiliation into hope. The bullies had tried to write his story for him. But David had taken the pen back, and in doing so, he taught everyone around him a lesson they would never forget. Years later, the memory of that courtyard humiliation remained etched in David's mind, but not as a wound anymore. It had transformed into the foundation of the man he became. The insults that once rang like chains in his ears were now distant echoes, reminders of how far he had climbed and how deeply he had grown. David stood on a stage much larger than the school auditorium where he first revealed his talent. This was a grand concert hall, the kind with velvet curtains, golden lights, and an audience that stretched as far as the eye could see. The seats were filled with people dressed in their finest clothes, waiting in silence, eager to hear him play. When David lifted his violin and let the first note float through the hall, the world listened. Every sound carried his story, his childhood, his silence, his resilience, his victories. He no longer played just for himself or even for his family. He played for anyone who had ever been mocked, belittled, or told they did not belong. Newspapers now carried his name. Critics praised his ability to make music that did not just entertain but healed. He traveled across countries, performing for crowds that stood to their feet in thunderous applause. His legacy grew not just as a musician, but as a voice for those who had none. At home, his mother no longer worked double shifts. She attended his concerts proudly, her smile brighter than the stage lights. Naomi, no longer a little girl, had grown into a young woman inspired by her brother's strength. She pursued her own dreams in education, carrying the same fire that had guided David. But what touched David most deeply was when letters began to arrive, hundreds, then thousands, from people he had never met. A boy wrote to say that David's story had given him the courage to stand up to his own bullies. A single mother wrote that his music gave her hope on nights when she felt she had nothing left to give. An old man wrote that David's violin had reminded him of his youth, helping him feel alive again. Each letter was proof that his journey had never been just about him. The humiliation he had endured, the silence he had carried, the strength he had built, it had all turned into something greater. A legacy that stretched beyond borders, beyond generations. One day, after a performance, David walked backstage and found a familiar figure waiting nervously in the corner. Mark, the boy who once mocked him, the one who had told him to go back to Africa, now stood older, humbled, his eyes unsure. "David," Mark said softly, his voice carrying none of its old arrogance, "I don't expect you to remember me kindly, but I needed to come. I needed to say that I'm sorry. For everything." David looked at him for a long moment. The memories rushed back, the courtyard, the laughter, the pain. But so did the memory of the day he had said, "Hate weakens you. I will not carry it with me." He smiled faintly. "I forgave you a long time ago," he said simply. Mark's eyes filled with relief. He nodded, almost unable to speak, before walking away quietly. That moment sealed the truth once and for all. David's legacy was not built on revenge or bitterness. It was built on forgiveness, strength, and the unshakable belief that dignity can outlast cruelty. Years later, when schools invited David to speak to students, he told his story with honesty but without anger. He described the courtyard humiliation, the silence he carried, the violin that saved him, and the strength he discovered within himself. Students sat in hushed silence, their eyes wide, their hearts heavy with understanding. He always ended with the same words. "They thought their cruelty defined me. But I chose to define myself. You have that power too." The lesson spread far beyond those classrooms. It spread through his music, his story, and the countless lives he touched. The terrifying truth the bullies had once discovered was now clear to the world. David was never weak. His silence was never surrender. It was strength in its purest form, and that strength became his legacy.